kind of the first thing really is to have a think about the ownership of your brand, because typically when you launch a franchise, you probably will have already done the development work in relation to the brand itself, and the intellectual property for the ownership of the intellectual property might not be where you think it is. So you need to think about, well, where is the ownership of it before you, I mean, you need to work out what intellectual property you have, and you also need to think about where's the ownership, because you need to lock down that ownership. So one of the first questions that I ask clients is, well, is any of that ownership potentially vested in any of the individuals? Because obviously all businesses start with an individual, and typically the individuals will have done some development work, and quite often some of the early work they'll have done will be in their own home or on their own before they've incorporated a company. Because the ownership of intellectual property, it can be a tricky thing, and you can have situations where the ownership rights to intellectual property is vested in more than one place. So you might have ownership vested in an individual and also in a limited company. So the first thing you have to think about is, where is the ownership of it? And then you've got to go on to think about, well, where do you want it to be? Because if you have worked out that actually a lot of the ownership is with the founders of the business, then you might decide you want to keep it there. Because one thing we always say to our clients, particularly if you have a lot of successful franchises start out as trading businesses, and they might run the trading business for a couple of years to prove the franchise concept, or they might have an existing business which they subsequently decide would be franchisable. So you might, for instance, have a business. I mean, I've come across domiciliary care businesses where there's been a successful company trading for 10 years, and there's a decision then made to franchise that company because the owners think, well, that's a good way of expanding. So you need to think about where you want that intellectual property to sit. So if you decide that you have worked out that the ownership of it is vested with the individual founder, then you might think, well, let's keep it there, because the risk in a franchise, from a franchisor's perspective, the legal risk, a lot of that is going to sit with the franchising company. And a lot of franchises will have a separate franchise company from which they will franchise the business. So if you've got an existing business called ABC Limited, which say runs domiciliary care, then if that's highly successful and highly lucrative, and it also owns all of that really useful and valuable intellectual property, the brand names and all the rest of it, you probably don't want to put all of that ownership and all of that goodwill and all of that value into the company that enters into the franchise agreements, because there's more risk there. So typically what businesses will do is they'll keep their intellectual property away from the main franchising company. So they may incorporate ABC Franchising Limited, and that is then the company that enters into the franchise agreement. So if you have a network, if you end up with a network of 50 franchisees, then what you can do is you can keep your valuable brand intellectual property rights in your ABC Limited, then you can license that into the franchising company, and then that franchising company can then sub-license that out to franchisees under franchise agreements. So there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. It's a good way of eliminating risk, because it keeps the value from a franchisor's perspective away from the franchising company. So it's quite a typical thing to do. And we normally advise clients to look at doing that, but also then put a formal license agreement into place. So you have a formal license agreement between ABC Limited and ABC Franchising Limited. You do need to take some advice on that on a tax perspective. I mean, we're lawyers, so we don't normally advise on tax, but quite often accountants and tax advisors, they don't really like splitting assets up, because when it comes to selling them, if you've got them spread all over the place, it can be inefficient from a tax perspective. So that's something to think about, how that's going to work from a tax perspective. You also need to think about, in terms of ownership, you need to think about third parties, because you might well find that people have helped you, particularly in the early stages, such as website developers or designers. They may well be intellectual property rights that are actually vested in them, because normally if somebody creates something, then they will have, in the absence of a formal legal agreement, they will have vested in them some of the ownership rights. So if you have let's say you have a logo design for you by a designer and you pay for that, in the absence of a formal assignment document, you will have an implied license to use it, but the person who's actually done the design work will still have some ownership rights. So you need to think about that. And one thing we normally advise our new franchisor clients is to think about that and look at what third parties have helped them and identify them, and then go to those third parties fairly early on and say, would you mind transferring the ownership rights to this intellectual property, be it a website, be it copyright or what have you, to us? And normally if you do it at the beginning, then they're going to be fairly relaxed about it. And some of them do have in their terms of business, they do provide that ownership goes over automatically, but it's certainly something to think about. So kind of moving on then, the next thing you need to think about is, well, what intellectual property do you have? Because typically we find that businesses, whether they're franchisors or not, quite often underestimate the amount of intellectual property that they have in their business. And certainly in a franchise, I think most of our clients will identify their logo, their brand, as being their intellectual property, but there will be other intellectual property out there. So the first one on that slide there is copyright. Now, copyright can find its way into all sorts of things. So that list of items there will all potentially have copyright. So the website wording, and again, that goes back to whoever's helped you write copy or your website designer. So you need to go to those people and say, we'd like you to assign all those ownership rights. Your operations manual will have copyright. And if you've written it yourself, then that's fine. But then obviously if you've used a third party to help you, as some people do, then there'll be copyright ownership there. So you want to go to that person to get them to assign that. And the same goes for marketing literature and internal systems documents. So where you've had third parties who've helped you, then you will need to think about where that ownership is and get those third parties to assign that over to you. I'm going to talk about employees a little bit later, but employees, you really need to just make sure with them, particularly the ones who are helping you actually design things and write things, you need to just make sure that those employment contracts have got appropriate clauses in, so in all the ownership of the intellectual property of anything they create whilst they're doing it in your employment moves over to you. A couple more things in there. Software, some people don't realize software is a lot of copyright in that, in the coding. That may not be relevant. If you're using off-the-shelf software, then it's not really an issue because you're just licensing it yourself, and then obviously your franchisees are using it. But if you're having bespoke software written for you and it's integral to your business, and you're using software designers, you might want to think about making sure that all the intellectual property comes over to you. What you don't want to do is find that you've paid a load of money for some software only to find that you don't actually own all the rights to it. You may find that certain software developers want to retain some rights to use some of what they've done in other products, but that's going to be something for negotiation. And then your logo as well, there'll be copyright in your logo, and that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about going to your designers. Then trademarks, obviously that's something you can protect by way of registration at the Intellectual Property Office, so that's e.g. your logo. Now trademarks, we say trademarks can be a trademark or a trade name, so you could potentially trademark at the Intellectual Property Office. You could make an application for a trade name as well as your logo. Now that's a little process in itself. I'll just mention in a minute whether you do it on your own or get a professional, but there's a slight difference between that and the company name. Some people think that because they're registered ABC Limited at Companies House, that they've got ownership of that name. Well, you kind of have and you haven't. What that means is nobody else can call themselves nobody else can register themselves as ABC Limited, but it doesn't stop somebody trading as ABC Limited. In the same way that if you manage to secure a company name of excuse me, Nike Limited at Companies House, you might think that you own the rights to that name, but all it means is that somebody else can't register that name, but that doesn't stop Nike jumping all over you for infringing their trademark and all the other intellectual property. So you don't gain a huge amount by registering a company name in terms of intellectual property ownership. Next on the list is patents. Probably fairly unusual in franchising. I don't come across many franchises that have got patentable intellectual property. Sometimes you'll get some sort of novel feature of a franchise, but generally patents aren't something that are really integral in most franchises. If they are, then you'll probably need to speak to a patent attorney. That's a highly specialist area. So the next point there is DIY or professional. So do you do it yourself or do you engage a professional? Now, you can do these things yourself, particularly registering trademarks. It's a fairly easy process to register a trademark, but there are some tricky aspects to it. One of those is which category you're registering your trademark in, so people can get caught out by not registering in the right categories. And then, as we'll see a bit later, we'll get the international perspective, and that's when it gets a bit more tricky, whether you're going to have UK, European, or worldwide, or different countries. And it gets more tricky then. And if you're likely to want to be franchising overseas, I would suggest that you consult either a lawyer who knows about these things or a trademark attorney, because you get trademark attorneys in the way you get patent attorneys, and they really understand the nitty-gritty, and they can give you advice up front as well in terms of what's likely to be registrable. And then you've obviously got registration fees. So if you do it yourself, yes, you'll save some fees in terms of the lawyer or the patent attorney or the trademark attorney, but there'll still be fees payable to the IPO. So I just wanted to touch on conducting IP audits. This isn't massively known well in franchising, but we do quite a bit of this. There is something called an IP audit, which you can potentially get funding for from the government. In Wales, which is where we're based in Cardiff, there are grants available from the Welsh government, and there's an equivalent scheme in England, and I would imagine in Ireland and Scotland, where you can get grants for undertaking IP audits. And basically what this enables you to do is to get a professional, so a lawyer or a patent attorney or trademark attorney, to come into your business, do a full audit of all your intellectual property, identify the intellectual property, and then go through that process that I mentioned earlier about working out, well, what have you got? Where's it vested? Do you need to approach any third parties? So helping you through that process of identifying what intellectual property you've got, so that you know that you've identified it all and you've taken steps to protect it. And as I say, you'll use an IP professional for that process, and also hopefully you'll get IPO funding of some sort for that. The other thing to think about is valuing your IP. It's becoming more and more popular for businesses to independently value their intellectual property. I think if you don't do this, you can miss out. Maybe not so much in franchising, because there's always a very much a perceived value to the to the brand, because it's just so important. But certainly you want to make sure you know what you've got and what the value is in it, because for one, if in the future you decide you want to attract some serious investors, they're going to want to know what they're investing in. So they're going to want to know what intellectual property you've got and that you've identified it and protected it, particularly with a franchise, because it is so valuable. So just want to talk briefly now about registration. So there's a number of areas where you can register intellectual property. The first one is copyright, which actually isn't an area that you can effect any registration, and it arises automatically. It is a fairly complicated area, but the long and short of it all is that copyright arises automatically. And that C you can see there on the right-hand side is something that people use to sort of underline the fact that they're claiming an ownership in copyright, but it doesn't imply any form of registration. So it will arise automatically, and normally it vests in the person who's created the copyright. So if you this afternoon, having listened to me, decided you want to write an article about this kind of thing, then you could claim the copyright in that article. And in the same way, people who do work for you might claim copyright in what they do, which takes you back to the earlier point I made about making sure that you've taken steps to identify and get the ownership of the intellectual property. So the next point is trademarks, and I've got UK, Europe, worldwide. I mentioned that earlier. It can be quite simple. If you've got a fairly straightforward logo that you want to register, then you can go to the IPO yourself. You can fill the forms in, pay the fee, and it'll be done. As long as you give a little bit of thought to it and make sure you've got the right categories. And if you're particularly just wanting UK, then that could be fine for you. But if you've got something that's more complicated, where you want a bit of advice, then it might be something you want to get a professional involved with. And then I've got patents there, which, as I say, that's a whole topic in itself. It's highly complicated. Most of the time in franchising, patents is not something that you're necessarily going to be touching on, because my experience is companies that are interested in patents are doing it for R&D purposes, and they're not normally interested in franchising. But it's something that does definitely require specialist advice. That's not something you want to just do on your own. And also licenses. So if you're licensing intellectual property, so if you're licensing a trademark from ABC Limited to ABC Franchising Limited, you can register it. You don't have to, but you can register it. It just gives you a bit more protection. So in terms of protection, just want to talk very briefly about what's not in the average franchise agreement to provide you with protection. So The first stop-off point here is NDA, so that's non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreements. So that's the first thing you do, and we always advise clients, franchisor clients, before you talk to anybody about your franchise, get them to sign an NDA or a confidentiality agreement. Before you start going into any nitty-gritty about it, make sure those documents are signed, because that will give you protection in relation to your business and in any intellectual property that you disclose. So you need to get that NDA signed early doors before you start standing out any real detail to prospective franchisees. So let's say you get over that hurdle, you get somebody signed up and they're signing a franchise agreement with you. Now, most franchise agreements follow a fairly similar format, and most of them have a similar sort of protection of intellectual property rights held within them, and that spills over into the operations manual as well. So just some examples of the kind of things that you'll have the benefit of. So normally any registered trademarks will be listed in a schedule to the agreement, so everybody knows what they're talking about. And the other thing you might want to think about as well is if the franchisor, so unless ABC Franchising Limited owns the intellectual property, you will need to make sure you have a license to use it from whoever does own it, whether that's ABC Limited, or maybe it's a master licensor. Maybe you're a master licensee of that, and you need to make sure you have that license, and that will normally be referred to in the recitals at the beginning of the franchise agreement, and typically the lawyer who advises the franchisee will want to see that. And then you might also, within the franchise agreement, you might want to include a separate trademark license. Some franchisors like to have a separate trademark license. Normally the franchisor, as I missed out a point there, the franchise agreement itself will grant the franchisee a license to use your intellectual property for the purpose of the franchise, but some franchisors like to have a separate license as well. It's not particularly common, but it does happen. Then the next question is, well, what happens if you develop new IP along the way? Because obviously, as a franchisor, one of your obligations is to develop the business. And during your process of doing that, you might well develop new intellectual property. Normally, a franchise agreement will automatically grant the franchisee rights to use any new developments, or typically any new developments of the brand. There can be a distinction there, because if you're developing something entirely different that's a new strand of the business, it might not be covered by the agreement, but quite often agreements do give the franchisees the right to use any new intellectual property that relates to the system that they're operating. And then there's a question of franchisee improvement. So generally a franchise agreement will allow you to take the benefit of any franchisee improvements without having to pay for that. And the other biggie in a franchise agreement is almost always they will contain post-termination covenants. And one of the big things in there is to protect you from your ex-franchisee going off and continuing to use your intellectual property. So there's a lot of protection in that franchise agreement, but only in relation to franchisees. Then the other thing you might want to think about, that penultimate point at the bottom there, is using your operations manual to set out brand guidelines. It depends really how much autonomy your franchisees have got in relation to your branding, but you might want to set out some brand guidelines in the operations manual. And also you may need to consider the content of a master license agreement, because if you're a master licensee, you need to think about what rights you've got to sub-license to the franchisees as well. So that's just a sort of an overview in terms of franchise agreements. Now, just want to talk about some of the commercial things. You can get caught up in the kind of, the registrations and the franchise agreements, but just thinking about some of the sort of day-to-day commercial things to think about. So this slide is heading placing your brand at the front of the market for maximum value. And here's just a few ideas here. So think about using customer rating services to boost social media exposure and increase trust in your brand. Obviously, there's a number of online customer rating services available now, and they are really useful for getting the rankings of your franchisees up, and that all boosts value in the brand. So that's something to think about. And then investing in the branding and marketing generally, because that strengthens the network and again increases the strength of the brand. And then even thinking about it from the perspective of recruitment, because franchisees are the life and soul of your business, and the recruitment of them, the careful recruitment of them, is really integral to your brand. Because if you unfortunately make the mistake, as inevitably everybody does from time to time, of recruiting somebody who doesn't fit and they turn out to be a bad apple, then they're going to affect your brand, and their their bad practices and non-adherence to the systems will affect the value of your brand. So the recruitment process is all part of brand protection. And also continuing to develop the franchise as well to keep ahead of the competition and give value to your franchisees, and just keeping the network motivated so everybody's on board, on message, and really going forward. Because there's no point in having a carefully designed brand and logo and all the rest of it, which has all been registered and fully protected, if your entire network's demotivated, because nobody's going to be out there selling it for you. What you want is a network of fully motivated franchisees who are all on board, who are all basically pushing this business forward, and that is the kind of thing that will improve the value of your brand. And also, just this next slide, talking about some quality control issues. So again, this is about brand protection. You might not immediately think of it, but it is, because thinking about monitoring franchisees, I mean, I'm sure most franchisors do that, but you do need to think about that. So you do need to think about things like minimum performance targets, and things like mystery shoppers, just to make sure everybody's sort of providing the kind of level of service that they're supposed to. I mean, it'll be set out in the operations manual, but unfortunately, not everybody does the right things at the right time. And then think about how you structure your MSFs, your management service fees, whether you have a different structure for higher performing franchisees. I think there's a bit of an art in terms of setting your management services fees, because there's lots of different ways of doing it. Some franchisors have fixed fees, some have percentages, a lot of them have sliding scales. And I think you can be quite creative in terms of how you do that, whether you incentivize high performing franchisees by saying they'll have to give you less of more, or whether you have a cap on it or whatever. But there's lots of different things you can do. And then benchmarking franchisees, so not to necessarily use it as a stick to beat them with, but to at least give them an idea of where they are against their peers, because they will want to know that. They'll want to know if they're performing well or badly, and if they're performing badly, they'll want your help in trying to perform better. So, you know, all in all, the better service provided by your franchisees, the better reputation and therefore value of your brand. And then just talking about dreaded social media, obviously it's very much part of our modern business world, and negative posts and comments from customers are a big deal, aren't they? So you need to think about how you're going to deal with those, and give some training to your franchisees on how to deal with negative online comments, because it's going to happen. You know, you can't keep all the people happy all of the time. So at some point, people are going to get negative posts, whether they want them or not. Doesn't matter how hard they try, it's going to happen. So you need to think about that, and maybe also think about managing social media accounts centrally. But then in terms of handling complaints, make sure all your franchisees are following a complaints procedure so that there's some consistency there. Franchising is all about consistency, and it should be all about consistency in relation to complaints. And then think about how you're going to educate them as to do that, and also support them through the process. How are you going to support them? Because it's a tricky one, isn't it? If a franchisee is not doing the right thing, and therefore you're having to deal with complaints, you have to deal with the complaint, but you still have to decide what you're going to do with the franchisee. And it might be a question of supporting them if they're having a bad time for whatever reason, and how you're going to do that. And then finally, do you have a disaster PR strategy for the network? So if something really goes pear-shaped, then what's your plan? And obviously COVID-19, that's something that everybody's had to deal with. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get through all of my slides. I'm going to say now that they are going to be available if anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards. They're mostly self-explanatory, so you can sort of get through them. I'll be able to get through a few more because I want to leave some time for any questions. So apologies for that. So just thinking about some hidden risks, and this is thinking, you have to think quite laterally to get to this point. But if you think about these issues that I've raised in this first point here about how franchisees are properly trained in relation to things like data protection, employment law and health and safety, those aren't core services. So those aren't necessarily the things that you've trained them to do. You know, if somebody's doing lawn care, you will have probably concentrated on lawn care as the thing that you're training them on. But if they get these other things wrong and they get problems and negative reviews as a result, then your brand's going to suffer. So you have to sort of think quite laterally, I think, with these things. I mean, at the end of the day, it's business issues. And I think you need to make sure that people are trained in relation to all of these issues, because they all will reflect on your brand. So again, provide training and refresher training. So Just sort of very quickly now, I'll probably just make this the last slide and then see if anybody's got any questions. So just thinking about if you've got problems with franchisees, as I say, significant brand damage can be caused by bad franchisees, and you have to have a plan really by how you're going to deal with those. Because you don't want to have to run to a lawyer every 5 minutes. So I think that you will definitely want to give some thought to how you're going to address breaches. And then you're going to have to think about how you're going to deal with them if you can't get any kind of joy from the franchisee. That may involve terminating the franchise agreement. And there will be certain things you need to do. You need to make sure your branded material comes back. And then you need to think about your post-termination covenants, because those are going to protect you. If you've got a rogue franchisee, they're going to protect you and make sure that they don't run off and try and pretend that they're still you or using your brand. So apologies, I'm not going to get through all these slides, unfortunately. I can kind of go on a bit. So I'm going to stop sharing this now. And if anybody's got any questions, because we are on a fairly strict 30-minute slot here. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, I think they're coming through on the chat function. We've got a few minutes. So somebody said, can we have a copy of your presentation, please? So yes, you certainly can. I'm going to provide it to the guys who have run the show, so they can farm it out. Or what I'll do actually is I'll put my details. In fact, if you just follow the link to Darwin Gray on the internet, and then you'll get to my link there. If you email me, and I'll be happy to send out the presentation to you.